Berlin was once the proud heart of Germany. Wide streets, grand buildings, and the confidence of a capital that believed it would rule Europe for 1,000 years. But by the early months of 1945, that image had already begun to crack. For years, Berliners had lived under the illusion that the war would never truly reach them. Victories on the radio, speeches filled with certainty, and promises of final triumph kept the population believing that Germany was still in control. But reality was moving faster than propaganda. By January 1945, the sound of war could already be felt, even if it could not yet be seen. Allied bombers had turned much of the city into ruins. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Nights were spent in shelters, days among smoke and broken walls. Still, life continued, not because people believed, but because survival demanded it. Food was scarce, electricity failed without warning. Children no longer played in the streets, they stood in long lines for soup, often returning home with nothing. The city that once symbolized power had become a place of quiet fear. Deep beneath the city, a different world existed. While civilians struggled above ground, orders were still being issued from offices and bunkers. Maps were spread across tables, lines were drawn and redrawn. On paper, Berlin was defended. In reality, the defenses were already collapsing. The German army was exhausted. Many soldiers defending the city were not trained troops, but old men and teenage boys. Weapons were limited, ammunition was counted carefully. Yet they were told the same thing again and again: Berlin would not fall. But the enemy was closer than anyone wanted to admit. From the east, the Soviet Red Army advanced relentlessly. Entire German divisions had been destroyed in weeks. Towns vanished almost overnight. Refugees flooded into Berlin with stories that could not be hidden, stories of defeat, retreat, and chaos. By March 1945, Berlin was no longer preparing for victory, it was preparing for impact. Barricades appeared on streets already damaged by bombs. Subway tunnels were converted into shelters and supply routes. Hospitals overflowed. The city felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. Above all this, the question lingered in silence. How long could Berlin survive when the war it had helped unleash was now knocking at its own door? The answer was coming fast. The first Soviet shells landed on the outskirts of Berlin before most of the city fully understood what was happening. There was no announcement, no dramatic warning, just a distant thud, followed by another, and then a rhythm that did not stop. For civilians, the realization came slowly. Windows rattled, dust fell from ceilings. Somewhere far away, a building collapsed. People paused, listening, counting the seconds between explosions. This was not another air raid. This was something different. By early April 1945, the Red Army had crossed the Oder River. What remained of Germany's eastern defenses crumbled in days. Entire units disappeared without sending reports. Roads leading into Berlin filled with soldiers moving west, not forward. Some still carried weapons, others carried nothing at all. Inside the city, official broadcasts continued to speak of resistance and final defense, but the streets told a different story. Military trucks rushed through neighborhoods without stopping. Barricades were built hastily, often with rubble from buildings already destroyed. Tram lines were torn up to block roads that no longer led anywhere safe. The population was ordered to prepare for house-to-house fighting. Many did not know how. Rifles were distributed with little instruction. Ammunition came in small boxes, sometimes only a few rounds per person. Boys barely old enough to shave stood beside men who had survived one war already. The city itself had become a trap. As Soviet artillery moved closer, entire districts were abandoned overnight. Families left behind everything they owned except what they could carry. Subway tunnels filled with people seeking shelter, sleeping on cold platforms, listening to the ground shake above them. Food deliveries stopped arriving, water pressure dropped, fires burned uncontrolled, sometimes for days, because no one could reach them. Hospitals worked without electricity, performing surgeries by candlelight while shells fell nearby. Fear did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like smoke. German officers attempted to organize defenses, but communication failed constantly. Telephone lines were cut, radio messages went unanswered, orders arrived too late or not at all. Berlin was being surrounded, and everyone inside could feel the circle tightening. Above ground, the skyline changed every day. Buildings that stood in the morning were gone by evening. Streets became unrecognizable. Smoke blocked the sun, turning daytime into a permanent dusk. And still, people waited. They waited in basements, in shelters, in underground stations. They waited for the sound of footsteps on the stairs, for knocks on doors, for the moment when the war would finally enter their street. By mid-April, the outer districts of Berlin were already under direct attack. Soviet units pushed forward block by block. Resistance was fierce in some areas, non-existent in others. There was no single front line anymore. The entire city was becoming the battlefield. What remained of Germany's leadership was now sealed underground, issuing commands that could not change reality. Above them, Berlin fought, burned, and endured alone. The siege had begun, and it would not end quickly. By the third week of April 1945, Berlin was no longer a city in the usual sense. It had become a maze of ruins, smoke, and shattered streets where every block could mean life or death. There was no clear front line anymore. The war had entered the neighborhoods. Soviet troops advanced carefully, knowing the danger that waited behind every wall. Buildings were no longer just structures, they were fortresses, traps, and graves. Windows became firing positions, staircases turned into choke points. Basements hid both civilians and soldiers, sometimes only meters apart. German defenders fought with whatever they had left. Regular army units mixed with militia, police, and teenagers from the Hitler Youth. Many had never seen real combat before. Some did not even understand the weapons they carried. Yet they were told the same message again and again: hold the street, no matter the cost. Artillery reshaped the city hour by hour. Entire blocks disappeared under bombardment. When tanks moved forward, they crushed rubble that had once been homes, schools, and shops. The sound of engines echoed through narrow streets, followed by explosions that shook even the deepest shelters. Civilians were trapped in between. Families hid in cellars while fighting raged above them. Dust filled the air. Breathing became difficult. Water dripped from broken pipes, mixing with blood and debris. People learned to recognize weapons by sound alone. The crack of rifles, the thunder of artillery, the sudden silence that followed an explosion too close to escape. Some tried to flee west, hoping to surrender to Allied forces instead of the Soviets. Many never made it. Streets were blocked. Snipers watched intersections. A wrong step could end everything. As the fighting intensified, discipline collapsed. Orders no longer mattered. Units fought independently, sometimes without knowing who was next to them. Confusion ruled the battlefield. Even experienced officers struggled to understand what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. Hospitals overflowed. Wounded soldiers lay side by side with civilians. Supplies ran out quickly. Doctors made impossible choices, deciding who could be saved and who could not. There was no time for mourning. Death had become constant. Above all this destruction, Berlin felt strangely isolated. Radios went silent. News from outside the city stopped. People inside did not know how close the end truly was. They only knew that the fighting was moving closer, street by street, building by building. The nights were the worst. Fires lit the sky. Shadows danced across ruined walls. The roar of battle never fully stopped. Sleep came in short, fearful moments, interrupted by explosions or screams echoing through the darkness. For Soviet soldiers, the city was a deadly puzzle. Progress was measured in meters, not kilometers. Each advance cost lives. Resistance was unpredictable, fierce in one street, absent in the next. Victory was certain, but it would not come easily. For Berlin's defenders, the reality was sinking in slowly. There would be no relief, no miracle counterattack, no last-minute rescue. The city was being consumed from the edges inward. And deep beneath the ground, in sealed rooms of concrete and steel, decisions were being made that would shape the final hours of the war in Europe. But above ground, Berlin had already entered its final phase. The battle for the city was no longer about strategy. It was about survival. As the fighting closed in from every direction, the center of Berlin became strangely quiet on the surface. Not because the war had slowed, but because the city's remaining leadership had disappeared underground. Beneath layers of concrete and steel, the bunker complex had become the final nerve center of the collapsing Reich. Maps still covered the walls, phones still rang, orders were still given, but above ground, those orders no longer meant anything. Communication with frontline units was unreliable or completely lost. Messages arrived late, if they arrived at all. Entire battalions were marked on maps as active, even though they had already ceased to exist. Reality and paperwork had separated completely. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere grew heavy and tense. Air was thick, lights flickered. The sound of artillery filtered down through the walls, constant and impossible to ignore. Every explosion reminded those below that the war was now happening directly above their heads. Meetings continued, but they changed in tone. Discussions were no longer about victory, but about delay. Hours mattered now, not days, not weeks, just hours. Above ground, Soviet forces pushed deeper into the city. Government buildings fell one by one. Defensive positions collapsed under sustained pressure. Resistance still existed, but it was uneven and desperate. Some units fought to the last man. Others surrendered as soon as they realized there was no purpose left. Civilians sensed the shift immediately. The rhythm of battle changed. Explosions came closer, then passed, then returned from a different direction. The city felt smaller, tighter, as if it were shrinking around those trapped inside it. In hospitals and shelters, rumors spread quietly. Some said the leadership had fled. Others claimed negotiations were happening. No one knew the truth, and no one trusted what they heard. Inside the bunker, isolation took its toll. Those present described a growing sense of detachment from the outside world. Time was measured by briefings and meals rather than daylight. News from the city arrived fragmented, often distorted by fear and exhaustion. Decisions made in those rooms could no longer change the outcome of the battle. They could only influence how many more lives would be lost before the end arrived. As April drew to a close, Soviet troops were fighting within a short distance of the government quarter. The final defensive ring had broken. The last symbolic strongholds were under direct threat. The idea of command itself began to collapse. Some officers quietly accepted the inevitable. Others clung to duty, believing that surrender without orders was unthinkable. The gap between ideology and reality widened with every passing hour. Outside, Berlin continued to burn. Streets once filled with traffic were now silent except for gunfire. Smoke hung low, turning daylight into a gray haze. Survivors moved cautiously through ruins, searching for water, food, or a way out that no longer existed. The city had reached a point where survival was no longer about sides or flags. It was about making it through the next minute. Deep underground, final preparations were being made, not for escape, not for victory, but for an ending that could no longer be delayed. Berlin was still fighting, but the war, as it had been known, was already over. By the end of April 1945, the sound of battle no longer came from the edges of Berlin. It came from everywhere. The city had been broken into isolated pockets, each fighting its own war, unaware of what was happening just a few streets away. Soviet troops reached the government district after days of brutal, close-range combat. Buildings that once symbolized power were now reduced to hollow shells. Flags were torn. Walls were blackened by fire. Nothing remained untouched. Resistance continued in fragments. Some German units fought out of habit rather than belief. Others surrendered quietly, exhausted and out of ammunition. Many civilians emerged cautiously from shelters, holding white cloths, unsure if the fighting had truly ended. Inside the bunker, events moved quickly and without ceremony. What had once been the center of command became a sealed chamber of final decisions. Within hours, the structure lost its purpose entirely. Orders stopped. Messages went unanswered. The chain of command ceased to exist. On the surface, Berlin felt unreal. Gunfire faded street by street. Fires still burned, but no one tried to stop them. Smoke drifted through empty avenues where only days earlier tanks and soldiers had clashed. The silence that followed was heavy, not peaceful. For the civilians who survived, the war did not end in celebration. It ended in confusion. People searched for family members among the ruins. Hospitals overflowed with wounded and sick. Food remained scarce. Entire neighborhoods were gone, erased so completely that residents struggled to recognize where they once lived. Soviet troops moved through the city cautiously, securing positions, collecting prisoners, and restoring basic order. The scale of destruction was immense. Berlin was no longer a capital, it was a symbol of collapse. News of Germany's surrender would come days later, but for those inside Berlin, the war had already ended in a far quieter way, not with announcements, but with exhaustion, with silence, with the realization that everything familiar had been destroyed. The city that once stood at the center of Europe now stood empty, broken, and divided. Yet life slowly returned. People cleared rubble by hand. Makeshift markets appeared. Children played among ruins, unaware of what those streets had witnessed only weeks earlier. Berlin did not recover quickly, but it endured. The fall of Berlin was not just the fall of a city, it was the final confirmation that the war in Europe had reached its irreversible end. What followed was not victory, but rebuilding, not triumph, but memory. And for Berlin, the scars of 1945 would remain visible for generations, etched into its streets, its walls, and its history. The battle was over, but the story of Berlin had only entered a new chapter. When the fighting finally stopped, Berlin did not feel liberated, it felt emptied. The silence that followed the battle was unfamiliar and unsettling. For weeks, people had lived with constant noise, artillery, gunfire, collapsing buildings. Now, the absence of sound felt almost dangerous, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Civilians emerged slowly from basements and shelters. Many stepped into streets they no longer recognized. Familiar landmarks were gone. Entire blocks had vanished. Some people stood in silence, trying to remember where their homes had once been. The reality of survival began immediately. There was no electricity in most areas. Water systems were broken. Food supplies were almost non-existent. People searched through ruins for anything usable: wood, metal, clothing, even paper. Barter replaced money overnight. A piece of bread became more valuable than currency. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Wounded soldiers, civilians, and refugees filled corridors and staircases. Doctors worked without proper tools or medicine. Infections spread quickly. Many who had survived the battle did not survive the aftermath. Soviet forces moved to secure the city. Checkpoints appeared. Curfews were enforced. Weapons were collected from civilians and remaining fighters. Order was restored slowly, cautiously, one district at a time. For Berliners, fear did not disappear with the end of combat. It changed shape. Uncertainty replaced terror. People did not know what the future would bring, who would rule the city, or how long the occupation would last. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed the war might restart. Others feared punishment simply for surviving. Mass graves were uncovered. Bodies were identified where possible, buried where they were not. The scale of loss became impossible to ignore. Nearly every family had been touched by death. Children adapted faster than adults. They explored ruins, played among rubble, and accepted the broken city as their normal world. For them, Berlin had never been anything else. Slowly, signs of life returned. Makeshift markets appeared at street corners. People repaired doors and windows with scraps. Trams began running on limited routes. The city did not heal, it functioned. Berlin was no longer a capital of ambition. It was a city of endurance. The war had ended, but its presence remained everywhere, in damaged buildings, in missing faces, in the quiet habits of people who had learned not to expect stability. This was not a victory story. It was survival. And Berlin's story was far from over.